Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry. So, Adam, I learnt something interesting and important that I feel I should share with you and all our listeners, assuming they haven't already heard it.
Ooh, do tell.
So, you know the film Independence Day with Will Smith and others?
And others. This is blatant Jeff Goldblum erasure, and I will not stand for it.
Okay, with Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum and others. Well, so famously, especially famously in the tech industry, they fly a stolen spaceship into the mothership and upload a Mac virus, and it works, and the whole thing explodes. Sorry to anybody who hasn't watched it. Spoilers. But yeah, you know that's what happens. And everyone in the tech industry is like, well, that's stupid because, how come there's compatibility, blah, 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 blah. Well, I learnt last night that actually it is an homage to War of the Worlds.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so I was in Smugland as well. Now, spoiler for War of the Worlds, have you not read or watched that? That the aliens are defeated not by man, but by the virus and bacteria that we have on Earth. And so, yes, it's a callback to that particular part of that particular film. And there are apparently various other sort of callbacks to War of the Worlds, but I thought that was quite interesting.
That is quite cool, I think. It's also a handy Deus Ex Machina, quite literally. But yeah, it doesn't quite make the sight of Jeff Goldblum uploading a MacOS virus into an alien mothership any less ridiculous.
Well, I mean, maybe next time you watch it, you will be slightly more inspired by the fact that it's called back to classic literature.
Well, classic literature aside, we're going to be talking about some more cybersecurity topics later in the show, but less about the technical side and more about the human side of cybersecurity.
Yes, our special guest this week is Stephen Burke, CEO and founder of Cyber Risk Aware. But first, let's turn to this week's top news stories.
First up this week, the government's coronavirus track and trace scheme has been ruled unlawful under privacy regulations.
Yes, so it turns out that the government didn't perform a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, before rollout, and the admission has come following some pressure from the Open Rights Group, which threatened to take the government to court over it.
Now, for anyone who's not familiar with the track and trace scheme, this is the government's effort to track and trace the spread of coronavirus through personal contact. So it's aiming to identify who people have been in contact with and whether or not they may have unwittingly spread COVID-19. But the problem that they're having is that this tracing, these plotting of connections between people is being done manually by actual human people. And there have already allegedly been data breaches via these human contact tracers who have been sharing the personal information and details of the people that they've been tracing and tracking in unregulated group chats on platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp.
Yeah, I mean, it's all pretty worrying. I think you point out the fact that these are human contact tracers. This is, I'm sure, at least in part due to the fact that this has just been such a big mess from the beginning, and then they wanted to do automated app with track and trace, but they wanted to build their own, and then that didn't work, and then they ended up going with Google and Apple API. But it's just, the whole thing has just been like, insert obscene comment here. It's just such a mess. And with the data breaches that are occurring, posting people's, not just their names, their addresses, contact numbers, their NHS number, which is a unique identifier and can identify you sort of across all your records if you've got it in theory. I mean, to my mind, is it a question of, do these people, have they just not had enough training? And is there any repercussions for them?
Training is a large part of it. the government's track and trace scheme has previously been accused of not providing enough training for the people who are acting as tracers. So I would not remotely be surprised to hear that they haven't been given anything in the way of kind of the GDPR and data protection training that they would need. As to whether or not they could potentially face consequences, I don't think that's hugely likely. The ICO has been working quite closely with the government on this and is certainly giving no indications that it will be taking punitive action for these lapses.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I find what the ICO has said regarding its involvement to be a bit problematic, and the ORG feel the same. So, as part of a statement given to us, the ICO said, "We have been working as a critical friend of the government," which is actually not how I want a regulator to work any more than I want them to be a critical friend of my bank or, a tourist organisation or whatever. They're a regulator. They're a regulator. Do the regulation. I know that the whole thing had to be fast, but there's fast and then there is sloppy.
Yeah, it's not an ideal situation. While I don't think the government is likely to face any legal repercussions from this, hopefully, at the very least, this incident convinces them to be a bit less cavalier when it comes to data protection. Elsewhere this week, Salesforce has abruptly shuttered its Einstein voice skills and voice assistant divisions. Now, this is Salesforce's burgeoning attempt to bring AI into the workplace and into business through things like a Cortana-style voice assistant to help you accomplish tasks in Salesforce and APIs and various connective tissue to stitch different elements of your business IT together. It made a lot of noise about Einstein when it launched about 2 years ago, hailing voice as the future of business communications, and has now announced that these two projects have been shuttered forthwith rather unceremoniously.
Yeah, it's worth noting that not everything is closing down. There is still the wider Einstein AI effort is ongoing. There are other voice initiatives that are under development. And so, the company hasn't given up on AI in particular, just these kind of more user-facing elements, I guess. I mean, what do you think has caused this? Is it a problem? When I think about voice assistants and stuff that I use, problems that crop up all the time are accuracy. Just like hands down, accuracy is a major problem and sometimes hilarious. And sometimes it's not actually easier than just typing out what you want to do. So I can see those as being potential issues. What about you?
So I think voice technology has been wildly overhyped by the tech and business community. I think voice definitely has a place, but it's not sophisticated enough yet to be able to replace traditional touch or mouse and keyboard inputs, and it's just not widespread enough for it to be a kind of natural way to interact with systems, particularly, as you highlighted, with the questions over accuracy and the trouble it has detecting things like accents and different speech patterns that aren't very defined.
I think the thing is as well that voice definitely has a role in IT, in technology, especially accessibility and particular use cases. But you have to, if it's to do with accessibility, then you have to kind of learn that, because it's not just talk at your computer. But like I say, I've always, other than shouting at Siri to time something when my hands are covered in dough or something like that, I've never really, or turn a light on and off. I've never personally found a particularly good use case for voice. I haven't used it really at all at work, and I can't think that I'm the only person there.
It's something that I think definitely has a place and definitely should be explored. Microsoft has been doing some interesting things on the accessibility front with voice technology, but as a core feature of something like Salesforce, it just doesn't strike me as something with enough universal appeal to be worth a huge amount of time and energy investment, and Salesforce clearly agrees.
And finally this week, Microsoft has announced that it will be moving Minecraft from AWS over to its own Azure cloud platform by the end of the year.
It was originally hosted on AWS by original developers Mojang in 2014, shortly before Microsoft acquired it. It's been running on AWS ever since then and currently supports a huge player base, 126 million monthly players by some counts.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really surprised me about this story is that it's happening now. I was really surprised to hear that it was on AWS, has been on AWS since 2016. And yeah, it struck me that given that Mojang only moved on to AWS shortly before selling Minecraft to Microsoft, it can't have been like super deeply integrated or any of those kinds of problems. So yeah, unless there's a contractual element, I'm amazed it took until 2020 from 2014 in the acquisition to get on with this.
I mean, it's a mammoth migration project, in fairness. Minecraft is absolutely huge, and it's got a lot of infrastructure, a lot of complex code to shift over, and LinkedIn was only ported over to Azure last year, and that's a comparatively simple shift. It's not nearly as complicated as something like Minecraft and doesn't have anything like as many simultaneous concurrent users.
Yes, and I suppose if they were building up their enterprise and business presence, which they were anyway, and then coronavirus comes along and suddenly thrusts things like Teams and to a slightly lesser extent, but Office 365 into the spotlight, of course you're going to throw resources at that lot, aren't you? You're not going to kind of go, oh yeah, also this game, even if it was intended to happen perhaps a little bit earlier, maybe it was held back until now, or maybe this was always the timeline and it just wasn't a particular priority, which I can also understand.
I mean, either way, it's a real show of confidence in Azure on Microsoft's part, because Minecraft is a huge feather in its cap and still a pretty big revenue generator for them, and will continue to be pretty much for the foreseeable future, I guess. I mean, yeah. I can't see them really making Minecraft 2.
No, and especially seeing as how we're still not as much as we were, but still largely stuck indoors quite a lot. And while we've got some nice summer weather as we record, that's also unpredictable. So it's always nice to have something to do while you are indoors. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people spending more time or starting up on Minecraft during lockdown.
Well, from building virtual Minecraft worlds to building a secure enterprise, after the break, we're going to be talking to Cyber Risk Aware founder Stephen Burke about the human side of cybersecurity, the psychological levers that hackers exploit, and whether or not we can truly defend against it.
See you after the break.
Welcome back. Now, we've all been told an awful lot about the human element of cybersecurity and the fact that humans are the weak point in any cybersecurity organization. Here to dive into some of the ways in which human beings are taken advantage of, some of the psychological levers that hackers can pull to get them to do what they want, is Stephen Burke, CEO and founder of Cyber Risk Aware. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So when it comes to security, we've seen the same tactics and the same techniques cropping up time and again for decades now. Phishing attacks, watering hole attacks, these things have been exploited by hackers since the dawn of cybercrime. How big of a challenge are these attacks to businesses? How much of the modern threat landscape, if you like, do they make up?
It's a great question. What we would typically see is that in over 90% of successful breaches or incidents that are caused by hackers or fraudsters, it is in most cases led by phishing emails. There is a rising threat of SMS text messages, but that can also be in combination with voice calls, or vishing as it's now known, or WhatsApp messages, which is called wishing. I think in security we're getting quite ishing, thinking we're quite humorous. But it's the biggest part, to be honest. And over 90% of budgets are spent on technical defenses, trying to protect the network. Yet the gaping hole every company has, and what I had found as a former chief information security officer, was that I hadn't done a good enough job of helping my staff help me defend the network. And as you said in your opening comments there, is that cyber criminals are exploiting people. They are actively targeting people. That is one of the biggest messages that we try to get out there, is that they are targeting people to get into systems, to get at the data. You only have to look at the Twitter hack last week, prime example.
So, Stephen, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and Cyber Risk Aware?
Sure. I'm a former chief information security officer, working in the insurance, reinsurance and financial services arena. I founded the company along with Barry and James in 2016. And that was really off my own experiences, where having invested in all the technologies and aligned to various security frameworks, I realized that cyber criminals were targeting my staff, and I hadn't done a good enough job of helping them help me defend the network. So hence why we created Cyber Risk Aware. And our number one goal is to help companies assess and mitigate human cyber risks, and to create a network of human sensors, a human firewall. And we do that by enabling companies to run phishing simulations, SMS text-based phishing simulations, and cyber knowledge assessments. So you can assess who needs help and who doesn't. No point in training everybody, only train those who need help on the various topics that you need to. And what we have done to revolutionize security awareness training is, rather than solely rely on scheduled training alone, which is what everybody has done to date, and again, if we keep doing the same things, we're going to get the same results. Why not tap into the network, which we are monitoring, and if we detect staff taking risky actions or risky behaviors, let's train staff immediately in response. And that's what we've done with real-time behavior-driven security awareness training, to explain the dangers of what staff are doing when they don't even know they're doing it. That's a game changer, and it means it's always on, it's consistent, it's repeatable. It'll enable you to meet your ISO 27000 or NIST Cyber Essentials compliance requirements, as well as any other regulatory requirement that you have.
It does seem, part of the reason that people do continue to fall for these kinds of attacks, despite the fact that we do get training, you do offer training, is that they're exploiting psychological traits just within humans themselves. We want to be part of an in-group. We want to please whoever the kind of alpha, if you like, in our organizational life is. And if you get something from the CEO saying, I need you to do X now, then you're more inclined to do it because of those reasons. Is that fair? And how do you kind of try to fight against those innate traits just within every human?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I probably would slightly disagree with the comment, whilst I would have actually been of the same opinion that anything from the CEO targeting any staff member would trigger a response. But that is somewhat changed in terms of the latest threats that are actually happening, or attacks, such as business email compromise, or CEO fraud as it's known. That is an email that's crafted to be made to look like it's come from the CEO. But actually, these emails are actually targeting other senior executives, not junior members of staff, and such as the CFO or people in accounting, for example. And that's really to try and trick them into spending money or wire money into accounts. So it's more high level to high level, not to junior folks. Where previously you probably would have said, look, it's a play on authority, where based on authority, I'm more likely to act and not ask any question, right? So that would have been historically happening, but not as much lately. But to come back to the psychological levers, depending on which part of the world you're in, you have common psychological traits as humans. So you have fear, desire, greed, curiosity, sympathy, and you have this. We try to build trust with people. We tend to think good of people, and that's what they're trying to play on. And when you look at the brain, to get a bit more scientific about it, you've got, so this is all social engineering. We're trying to socially engineer somebody into doing something they otherwise would not do. And you've got the lizard brain, which is obviously the oldest and most primitive. It's concerned with self-preservation. And then you've got the limbic side of the brain, which is also known as the mammal brain, which is about acting on instincts and hardwired beliefs. And so the psychological aspect of social engineering is trying to play on these traits of folks that they make instant decisions. So an email with a subject matter that your bank account has been hacked, you must do this right now. That is very emotive. People act on that because they're obviously sensitive to money. So people act on that. So urgency, a sense of urgency. And what they're actually trying to do is, before the thinking brain kicks in and analyzes this, they're trying to be tricked before that kicks in. So the neocortex is what that would be. So they're trying to interrupt that signal. And that's the psychological aspect of it, behind it.
And I think one of the most powerful techniques that we see kind of time and time again, particularly in social engineering, is the natural aversion that most people have, certainly most people in the UK specifically, to conflict and to kind of confrontation. One of the most common techniques for physically compromising a building or a company and actually getting into the building and getting physically onto the network and all of these kind of tactics is just to wear high vis vest, a lanyard, and just walk in with purpose on the basis that no one is going to challenge you, because challenging you will result in an awkward confrontation, and nobody wants to have that if they don't, if they can possibly avoid it.
Yeah, again, a good point. And this often raises a question as to the type of personalities when you look at security guards on the front desk inside buildings. We've looked at this before, and as a CISO, I would have carried out types of tests like this where I would have somebody come in a suit rather than a high-vis jacket. But wearing a suit on a phone, pretending to have an irate argument on the phone, and then give one of those stares that makes you, feel a little bit sweaty under the collar when someone gives it to you. And if a security guard does not match that person's eye-to-eye contact and looks down, they are more likely than not to let that person through the security barrier. Where really what should happen is, I'm not opening that security barrier until you come over here and get off that phone. And that's what you're trying to test. And, this brings up another point, that often people on the inside think that the outside perimeter controls, that's what keeps them secure. It's the same when you think of staff on the inside, that they say, well, IT security and IT, they've bought these technical defenses to defend the perimeter of the network. That keeps us secure. It's not my job. So same thing, that, once somebody gets through those defenses, well, then it's, carte blanche. They're able to move around freely. Companies work on the basis that they're protecting the perimeter, and that once somebody is on the inside, either physically or moving around the network electronically, that should be trusted because the perimeter has allowed that to happen. Whereas, whether it be working from home has exacerbated this issue, but when people get onto a corporate network, there should be zero trust applied to that, because the network is so porous today with mobile devices, working from home, that you really have to focus on your digital assets that you most care about and protect them and harden those. And really what's going on around the rest of the perimeter, you can't really satisfy yourself that it's fully secure.
Yeah, I mean, working from home, there seems to be a lot of mixed opinion in the security industry as to how much of a threat it actually poses to businesses. What's kind of your take on that?
It depends on the organization, right? Every company is different and they have different resources. So you have small companies that had to rush out and buy equipment and didn't secure it, and they just wanted their staff working, right? So that's, to me, is a recipe for disaster. And I dare say some medium enterprises have suffered the same thing, and maybe even some large companies too. So we just published a thought leadership piece around coming back into the workplace, and really what we were trying to call out were the risks that are probably present now as a consequence of working from home. So one, you have insecure equipment that may have been bought in a bit of a panic to get up and running. As a consequence, they've been less secure. Maybe people have been using personal accounts to log in. They have been saving company data on those insecure devices. They may have even been saving company data or personal identifiable information in personal accounts in cloud file, public file sharing utilities. That data may now leave the European Union and the UK, which could be a GDPR issue for companies. So we're going to have to get a handle on what have people been doing when working from home. Have they had viruses on their machine? Have they shared the devices with fellow family members? Have they given away their credentials so that family members could use those devices? To me, until people ask those questions and find out the answers, they're going to only get a true sense of the level of risk that is presented when people come back into the workplace. And that's, people have been using passwords, have they used the same password across work and personal accounts, for example? If somebody has, caused a fraudster or a hacker to have access to that, laptop, when that gets connected to the corporate network, is that going to mean that they can now start to move around that corporate network freely? Has there been monitoring in place? So the answer is, I think it's a big issue, and I think it's not assessed enough to date, but people need to start thinking about it. And I know they've been incredibly busy, hard to switch off, and trying to make sure people have been working remotely. And it's one thing to keep working and keep the business up and running, but I think risks have actually elevated as a consequence during this time.
So on that note, one of the trends that we've seen being talked about a lot is an uptick in phishing, particularly targeted spear phishing, trying to exploit the fact that everyone is working from home now. No one really has physical face-to-face contact in the way that they did previously, and a lot of businesses are now using a greatly increased amount of cloud tools and cloud resources, which of course opens up a lot of new potential attack surfaces for hackers. So have you seen a shift in the way that hackers are targeting people, kind of psychologically speaking, based on the whole working from home trend? We would have looked at action fraud in terms of their statistics, as well as obviously what our clients have been telling us, and over 600% increase in fraudulent phishing campaigns predominantly, but also SMS text message campaigns. And that has, been trying to trick people into maybe fake charities, making donations to fake charities, whether it be WHO and announcements with links to websites that if you visit, they then cause ransomware to be installed on devices, which obviously we all know is painful, and it encrypts data, and either you pay the ransom to get your data back or you restore from backups. So there's been a big increase in that, as well as those business email compromise type emails that I described earlier on. And it has been predominantly phishing emails, but the sophistication of the emails, that is what's been surprising, and they can feel very targeted, but therein lies the issue of today's society. We have so much information out there that, we can find out the CEO of a company, the directors in a company, the CFO. We can find out, staff on LinkedIn, for example, where they work, what technologies they use. And you can then craft an email based on all of that information to say, okay, these guys use Zoom, or they use Adobe, or they use Microsoft, they use whatever other technologies that one can avail of. They craft emails to make look like internal systems that are being used, and to trick people into, remote access is being disabled. Please click here to verify
your account credentials. They then type in their username and password, and it leads to a loss of credentials, which then brings me on to another point, which is credential harvesting has been one of the biggest issues during this as well. And what I mean by that is obtaining usernames and passwords so that they can obviously then access the accounts or sell them on the dark web to make money. Ultimately, that's what most cyber criminals are trying to do anyways, make money. And if companies have not been using multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, that it makes it so easy. So companies need to have employed that, but a lot of people haven't, and it has led to a loss of credentials, and system has been compromised as a consequence. And when you look at the reported cases of the Iranians and Chinese and Russians trying to steal COVID-19 vaccine research and trials and whatnot, they are targeting people based on that information and trying to get their credentials.
So, Stephen, we've spoken sort of about the technical side of the evolution of attacks, but speaking again about the kind of psychological side, the persuasion side, has that evolved significantly in terms of tactics as well?
I think it's in keeping with the sophistication. They're more believable. It's no longer, a prince from Africa, let's say, offering money. It's now emails that are very businesslike. We have seen one client in the States where they used a particular type of email template just purely internally. They had crafted it internally, and they received a phishing attack exactly using the same template, using internal systems, and that's purely down to information being identified during a hacker's initial stages of an attack, which is information discovery. As I said, that's freely available, so they just leverage what's out there. And by crafting something that's very normal, part of day-to-day, people's guard is down as a consequence. Plus then if it's sent from somebody that they believe to trust subliminally because of who is sending it, so the CEO or the CFO or somebody else like that, that's what tricks people. Their guard is down. Companies have tried to run phishing simulations, and this can be quite contentious, where they want to run phishing simulations, but they make them easy because they don't want staff feeling like they're being tricked or made to feel silly. Where we would often advise folks to say, actually, cyber criminals aren't going to make this easy. They are actively targeting your staff. In order to prepare, you have to create the realistic scenarios here based on systems that you're using, or you maybe have spoken about in public forums that cyber criminals will use against you. And that's what you need to do to raise awareness with staff, so that if they do get an email in like that, you will have forewarned them in a controlled way of what to do. And otherwise, it's going to be super easy for the cyber criminal, and they have to approach it like that. So the sophistication has gotten better so that they're more trustworthy and believable by internal staff. And that's why I think they're having more success than ever.
So it sounds then like, while attackers may be using psychological tricks against their targets, we can also, or security teams can also use almost similar tricks, like getting people to be part of the in-group, wanting to please, all that kind of thing, to thwart attacks and keep businesses more secure. Is that kind of the end game of all this?
The end game is that the whole company has to act as one, and we call it creating a network of human sensors, this human firewall. And by creating security champions who represent the IT and IT security and the security awareness function, it means that you've got there's an ever presence in all these meetings that are happening across the company, and therefore security is built in to the culture, into the ethos, such that you might have a project team meeting and they're talking about a new piece of software. It's going to have data and it's going to go here, there, and everywhere. Someone has to say, hang on a second, data protection needs to be built in here from the start, and we need to involve the security folks to help us understand what the risks are and what we should or shouldn't do. That starts off from the top, where they explain how important this is to the company, because it can actually, if it's not done right, you can put a company out of business. So it's a material risk depending on obviously the organization, but it's that important that people are being targeted. I've said that at the start and I'll say it again. We can buy all the technology you want. Over 94 billion has been spent on technology defenses, yet the number of incidents continues to increase. That tells us that we're spending the money in the wrong ways. If we keep doing the same things, we're going to keep getting the same results. People is the biggest gap in controls. It's a human-centric approach, and we have to focus on that. Aligned to the technical approaches, I'm not saying not to have them, but you have to have them, but you have to focus on the human side. And that is a collective responsibility. It's a business risk, not an IT risk. And as soon as that's understood by everybody, I think we'll be in a better place.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you once again, Stephen Burke, CEO and founder of Cyber Risk Aware, for joining us.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website www.itpro.co.uk. While you're there, why not sign up for the Business Briefing, your weekly guide to all the best content from ITPro, The Week and Money Week.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts. And if you can, leave us a rating and review to help other people find the show.
We'll be back next week with even more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, bye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.